In a quiet stretch of Buckinghamshire countryside, where lanes bend through hedges and fields and almost every sound carries, a house stood back from the road on its own 11-acre estate. It looked like the sort of place people imagine when they think of safety. Space. Silence. A long drive. A farmhouse set far enough away from strangers to feel protected from them. That image lasted until the morning of April 11, 1995, when a builder named Nick Marshall arrived with his son at the Brown family home on Spriggs Holly Lane in Radnage and heard the alarm sounding inside. As Nick moved closer, he looked through a window and saw a woman lying at the bottom of the stairs. Her name was Janet Brown. She was 51 years old. By the time anyone understood what had happened in that house, the calm image of the place had already been destroyed. What waited inside was not just a killing, but a scene so violent and so strangely arranged that even after decades, it still resists any simple explanation. Janet Brown had been born in Southampton. She trained as a midwife and later worked as a research nurse with Oxford University at John Radcliffe Hospital, in public health and primary care. The people who knew her remembered a gentle woman, calm in nature, kind in habit, deeply attached to her family. She loved travel, loved being outside, loved the quiet steadiness of ordinary life. She was married to Graham Brown, who worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and together they had 3 children, Zara, Roxanne, and Benedict. Like many mothers, Janet seemed to hold the family together almost invisibly. When Graham's work took him abroad, she was the constant one. The steady one. The person who was always there. Zara had already moved to London after university. Benedict, 21, was away completing his degree. Roxanne, the youngest at 17, still lived at home. If you have ever looked back at a normal family routine and realized how fragile it was, this part of the story lands hard. Nothing about Janet Brown's life pointed toward a violent end. That is part of what makes the case stay with people. The area around Radnage had recently seen burglaries, and Janet took security seriously. She joined the local neighborhood watch. She had a panic alarm installed in the house. She noticed risk. She prepared for it. If you are the sort of person who checks the lock twice before going to bed, who listens for a sound downstairs before you can relax, this case reaches you quickly, because Janet Brown was not careless. She was alert. She had done the sensible things people are told to do. And still, on the night of April 10, she was alone in that house. That Monday had started like an ordinary day. The Brown home was in the process of being sold, and an offer had already been accepted. Janet left work and drove home in her Volvo. Roxanne had made a last-minute plan to go out with a friend to celebrate passing their driving tests, leaving the house at around 3:30 in the afternoon. Graham was away in Switzerland for work. By evening, Janet would be on her own. At some point around 8 that night, Janet spoke on the phone to one of Roxanne's friends. Not long after, at around 8:20, Nick Marshall tried calling about the building work arranged for the next day. There was no answer. At 9 o'clock, Graham also called. Again, no answer. A little later, at roughly 10 that night, a neighbor drove past the Brown house and heard the alarm sounding. When she returned later, the external alarm had fallen silent. The internal alarm kept going. That detail would matter. The alarm system had been triggered by the 2 panic buttons inside the house. One was near Janet's bed. The other was near the front door. Somewhere in the middle of fear and struggle, Janet had managed to activate the system. What she was trying to stop, and at what exact moment she pressed it, would remain unclear. But the alarm sounded. And the person inside the house stayed anyway. The next morning, around 8 a.m., Nick Marshall made the discovery that ended any hope of a misunderstanding. Janet Brown was found at the bottom of the stairs, her hands cuffed behind her back, parcel tape covering her mouth. Blood spatter marked the walls and ceiling. She had suffered massive head injuries after being struck repeatedly with a blunt object, something like a crowbar. She was naked, restrained, and gagged. Yet there was no evidence of a sexual assault, and the scene did not point toward a sexual motive. That contradiction sits at the center of the case. Janet's clothes had been folded neatly beside the bed. Her dressing gown lay on the floor. The house had been searched extensively, almost aggressively, yet nothing appeared to have been taken. The television and VCR had been unplugged, but left behind. Money remained in a pot in the kitchen. There was no obvious theft, no obvious sexual motive, no simple pattern that would let the mind settle. You keep waiting for the missing piece to arrive. It never quite does. Entry to the house appeared to tell its own disturbing story. The intruder had tried to cut a hole through the patio door using glass-cutting equipment. Before that effort was completed, the second panel was smashed. Tape and handcuffs had been brought to the scene in advance. So had the tool used to attempt entry. This was not a spontaneous act in the ordinary sense. It carried planning. But it also carried a recklessness that planning usually avoids. That is one of the reasons the case unsettles people. Why target a house that so clearly appeared occupied? There was a car in the driveway. Lights were on. The home did not look empty, abandoned, or easy. The Brown estate was remote enough that a stranger could get lost trying to find it, yet visible enough that whoever came there likely understood the area. And once inside, with the alarm sounding, that person did not flee. Instead, the violence continued. The bedroom became central to understanding those final moments. The route from the patio door to the bedroom would have taken only about 30 seconds. That was likely where Janet first came face to face with the intruder. A small piece of tape was found on the bedroom floor. Marks on her body suggested she had been forced down onto her back. The tape over her nose and mouth had been wound so tightly that she may have suffocated within minutes. The key to the handcuffs was found beneath her body. The weapon itself was never recovered. Then there was another detail that makes the whole sequence feel even colder. Diluted blood was found on the bedroom light switches, suggesting the killer washed blood from his hands and then returned upstairs. That single action has haunted the case for years. It speaks to time. Composure. A disturbing refusal to panic. Most people hear that and immediately feel the same thing. This was not someone overwhelmed in the moment. Or if it began that way, it became something far more controlled. Still, the case never settled into one clear category. Was this a burglary that turned savage after an unexpected encounter, or had Janet Brown been chosen before the first cut touched the glass? People tend to divide here. One side sees preparation and focus, and believes the attack began with a person in mind. The other sees confusion inside the house, the messy contradictions, the pointless searching, and thinks something spiraled after entry. Both views sound reasonable. Neither view explains everything. The estimated window of death fell somewhere between about 8:15 and 10:15 that night, based on the calls Janet answered and the ones she missed, along with the timing of the alarm. During those hours, neighbors and others in the area noticed very little. One person driving along Spriggs Holly Lane saw a car parked back from the road near a spot locally known as the Triangle. Because of recent burglaries, that kind of thing stood out. But suspicion is easy after the fact. At the time, it was just another odd detail on a quiet road. And this is where a case like this starts speaking directly to something many people already know. Life-changing moments rarely arrive with a warning label. They pass in fragments. A parked car. A missed call. An alarm in the distance. A plan changed at the last minute. Roxanne had been meant to stay at the house that night with Janet, along with a friend. The arrangement fell through when the friend's mother felt nervous about a new driver traveling that far. Roxanne later carried deep guilt about not being there. It was the kind of guilt families know is unfair and still cannot put down. In the days that followed, the investigation spread across the house, the gardens, and the wider area. Thousands of inquiries were made. Roughly 2,000 witness statements were taken. The search was exhaustive. Every physical detail inside the home seemed to offer possibility, yet each possibility opened into more confusion. The all-weather tape used during the break-in was unusual, the kind often associated with greenhouse repairs. The masking tape was common. The handcuffs were common. The glass cutter was unusual in that setting. Taken separately, those items did not reveal much. Taken together, they felt like a pattern waiting to be recognized by the right person. That hope lingered through the early months. Someone out there had to know a man who came home bloodstained that Easter week. Someone had to remember an odd purchase, a suspicious set of tools, a change in mood, a story that did not make sense. The brutality mattered here. Janet's attacker would not have walked away clean. This was not the kind of crime a person could tuck neatly behind a normal evening and forget. Yet silence held. 10 months later, 2 answering machine messages arrived from a man who did not identify himself. The voice sounded as though it carried information that mattered. He never came forward. He never called again. That vanishing act became its own piece of the case, one more shadow around an already shadowed story. In June 1996, a 47-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of Janet Brown's murder. His identity was not made public. That lead, too, went nowhere. As the years passed, the damage settled deepest inside the family. The Brown house was never home again. Janet's children did not return to live there. Roxanne later moved to London to stay with Zara while finishing her A-levels. Fear entered ordinary routines. Doors and windows were reinforced. Security became a daily habit rather than a precaution. Panic attacks appeared. Sleep changed. The body remembers what the mind keeps trying to file away. That is true for more people than they like to admit. Roxanne remained especially affected by the vulnerability of what had happened. Janet had been alone. Defenseless. Handcuffed. Bludgeoned. The violence felt excessive even for murder, as though force had continued long after control had already been established. It is one thing to understand a fact. It is another to live with the image behind it. If you have ever tried to make peace with something that never made emotional sense, you understand the trap the Brown family was left inside. Time moved forward. Their grief stayed anchored to one night. There were several theories, and each one broke down under pressure. Robbery gone wrong did not fit comfortably. Most burglars avoid occupied houses. Most burglars do not spend time cutting glass, then smashing it, then staying while an alarm sounds, then searching extensively, then leaving obvious valuables behind. Contract killing seemed too elaborate in the wrong ways. If Janet was the target of a straightforward professional hit, why the searching, the waiting, the noise, the unnecessary risk? A sexually motivated killing did not align with the evidence. Industrial espionage surfaced because of Graham's work as a research chemist, but it led nowhere. Kidnapping failed too, because there was no real effort to remove Janet from the house. If you believe every crime must eventually fit a known box, this case quietly challenges that instinct. Sometimes the categories are not wrong. They are just incomplete. Sometimes a person comes to a house with one plan and leaves behind another. Sometimes motive is not absent, only hidden behind behavior that looks irrational from the outside. And sometimes the ugliest truth is that a person can prepare carefully and still act in ways that seem chaotic once the violence starts. For nearly 2 decades, the case remained cold. Then, in 2015, forensic advances opened a path that had not existed in 1995. A review of the case generated a DNA profile from material left at the scene. The DNA belonged to a man who was not a member of the Brown family. That should have felt like a turning point. In one sense, it was. In another, it deepened the frustration. The profile did not match anyone on the national database, even with millions of records available for comparison. More than 1,000 men were screened and ruled out as the pool was narrowed. The DNA did not vanish. It remained there like a locked door with the key missing. That is the strange emotional shape of some cold cases. A family can move from having almost nothing concrete to having one powerful piece of evidence, and still wake up every day without a name. Relief and torment begin to live side by side. By then, 20 years had passed since Janet Brown died on the floor of her own home. Her children were no longer the young people she left behind, but the night of April 10 still traveled with them. Zara lived with panic and nighttime fear. Roxanne became highly security conscious, unwilling to run alone in the woods or countryside, always making sure someone knew where she was going. That may sound like caution. It is also inheritance. Violence can pass through a family without repeating itself. It simply changes the way safety feels forever. The countryside around Radnage still looks much the same. Quiet. Rolling. Beautiful in the restrained English way that makes people lower their voices without meaning to. On the surface, it is hard to connect that setting with a scene as brutal as Janet Brown's murder. But perhaps that is another reason the case still lingers. It forces a thought many people resist. Danger does not only belong to places that look dangerous. Sometimes it arrives in the landscapes people trust most. There is also the question of what kind of person could have done this. The intruder came prepared with tools, tape, handcuffs, and likely a torch. He forced entry into a house that seemed occupied. He encountered Janet. He restrained her. He attacked her repeatedly. He stayed while the alarm sounded. He washed his hands. He returned upstairs. He searched. Then he left, taking the weapon and leaving behind only fragments. This was not simple rage. It was not simple fear. It was not simple greed. The behavior feels planned in one moment and unhinged in the next. Midway through the story, this is usually the point where people begin arguing quietly with themselves. Which detail matters more, the preparation before entry or the strange conduct after it? The tools suggest intention. The searching suggests distraction or a second purpose. The lack of theft suggests one truth. The extensive ransacking suggests another. The neatly folded clothes suggest a moment of chilling order. The smashed glass suggests risk and noise. If you have ever found yourself returning to a single case because the facts refuse to sit still, this is why. And beneath all of it is Janet herself, a woman who should have had years left with her family. A mother who worked, cared, planned, protected, and expected to wake up the next day and continue an ordinary life. That may be the hardest part of this case. Not the mystery by itself, but the ordinary goodness interrupted by something so extreme. It leaves behind a form of discomfort that many viewers recognize immediately. You do everything right. You stay alert. You look after people. And still the world can open beneath you. A reward eventually rose to as much as £20,000 for information leading to a conviction. The possibility was left open that the killer might already be dead, in which case relatives could still provide the missing link through DNA comparison. That idea carries its own bleak weight. A family can wait 30 years and still not know whether the person they are waiting for is alive, dead, close by, or someone they once passed in a shop without realizing. There is no neat emotional ending inside that kind of uncertainty. So the case continues to rest on a narrow but powerful line of truth. Janet Brown was killed in her home in Radnage on the night of April 10, 1995. The attack was brutal. The scene was staged in no obvious way and explained by no single obvious motive. An unknown male DNA profile was recovered years later. It belongs to someone who has still not been named. Someone, somewhere, fit inside that house on that night, and then stepped back out into the dark countryside carrying blood, knowledge, and silence. How do families live with a silence like that? Not by solving it in their own hearts. Not by moving on in the simple way people like to imagine. They live beside it. They build routines around it. They grow older with it. And somewhere in Buckinghamshire, under the same quiet skies and along the same narrow roads, the unanswered part of Janet Brown's story remains exactly where it has always been, waiting for the one thing it has never yet received, a name.